we find ourselves in a position where we must take immediate, drastic action to protect our people from federal overreach.
Chicago's mayor, once posing as an activist for the people, has just been exposed in court for ties to cartel leaders. Now, Trump threatens Operation Sweep, a move that could ignite national chaos. Calls are intensifying, tensions escalating, and America hangs on a razor's edge. Johnson versus Trump. Chicago, once celebrated as one of America's great cities, has in recent years been defined by soaring crime rates, political clashes, and intensifying federal scrutiny. Central to this struggle is Mayor Brandon Johnson, whose tenure has been marked by sharp opposition to federal intervention and frequent sparring with Donald Trump. In court filings, public statements, and media appearances, a narrative has emerged portraying Johnson as defiant, yet increasingly cornered by the realities of violence in his city. The backdrop is Chicago's entrenched crime crisis. For 13 consecutive years, Chicago has recorded the most murders of any U.S. city. For 7 consecutive years, it has had the highest murder rate among cities with over 1 million residents. In 2024, the city's murder rate per capita was 3 times higher than Los Angeles and nearly 5 times higher than New York City, exceeding Islamabad's and multiplying Delhi's nearly 15-fold. Of the 147,899 reported crimes in 2024, arrests were made in only 16% of cases. Even when statistics showed slight improvements, the scale of loss was staggering.
They're saying that the crime is down from last year. So that's their argument. But so last year there were 500 people killed, let's say, and this year they're up to 250. So they don't give a about the people, because 200, whatever the number is, even if it's 10 people, it's 10 too many.
These grim figures provided ammunition for Trump, who repeatedly attacked Johnson's leadership. In direct remarks, he called Johnson grossly incompetent and vowed intervention.
When we're ready, we'll go ahead and we'll straighten out Chicago, just like we did D.C. Chicago is very dangerous.
He contrasted Chicago's decline with his personal ties to the city.
Great place. I built great stuff there. I have the most beautiful building in Chicago, I think.
Trump's tone was clear. Federal patience had limits, and Chicago might soon face direct intervention. Johnson, however, responded with hostility and accusations of racism. Asked about Trump labeling him incompetent, Johnson dismissed the critique, pivoting sharply.
The president has always been intimidated by the intellectual prowess of black men. And so, of course, he would speak in those petite and puerile terms because he's small.
To Johnson, Trump's threats were less about Chicago's safety and more about personal prejudice and political theater. Yet in practice, Johnson recognized the looming threat of federal force. Anticipating a crackdown, he signed sweeping executive orders positioning Chicago to resist militarization.
And we find ourselves in a position where we must take immediate, drastic action to protect our people from federal overreach.
His directive ordered the city's Department of Law to pursue every available legal avenue to block federal intervention. It further stipulated that the Chicago Police Department would not collaborate with federal or military personnel on patrols or immigration enforcement. As Johnson framed it, the priority was to shield Chicagoans' rights against unconstitutional intrusion. Critics, however, pointed out glaring contradictions. While Johnson publicly stood firm against Trump, he appeared unwilling or unable to confront the gangs and armed networks fueling Chicago's bloodshed. Commentators asked why the mayor could speak boldly against Washington, but not against those terrorizing his own neighborhoods. One viral commentary mocked this discrepancy.
So you're going to stand up to the federal government, and you're going to stand up to help, but you don't stand up to the gangbangers and savages gunning down your citizens by the hundreds every year. You're not going to stand up to the people who shot 54 and killed 7 over this past Labor Day weekend. You ain't going to do to them, but you're going to talk tough to the president.
Over Labor Day weekend, 54 people were shot and 7 killed across Chicago. Several incidents were mass shootings, with multiple victims hit in single bursts of gunfire. Among the casualties was a teenage girl struck by a stray bullet. Despite these tragedies, Johnson continued to emphasize political resistance over direct security cooperation, vowing that Chicago would not become an occupied city. Meanwhile, Johnson attempted to redirect blame away from his administration and toward external sources. He repeatedly claimed that Chicago's violence problem stemmed from gun trafficking by Republican-led states. In his words,
"We need the federal government to stop the endless flow of guns into our state and into our city. Chicago police officers have taken more than 24,000 guns illegal guns off the streets of Chicago since I've taken office.
He reiterated that the majority of these weapons were not manufactured in Illinois, but instead trafficked from states like Indiana, Mississippi, and Louisiana. From Johnson's perspective, so long as red states supplied the weapons, Chicago would remain vulnerable. This explanation, however, was derided as insufficient and politically motivated. One commentator summarized the skepticism.
Chicago will continue to have a violence problem as long as red states continue to have a gun problem.
Roughly 30% of your adult residents are functionally illiterate. Fewer than 1 in 3 Chicago school children can read at grade level. 80% of your black children are born to fatherless homes. Your homeless rate tripled in 2024. There were 1,200 store burglaries in June alone.
As Trump and Johnson's conflict escalated, the courtroom became a symbolic and literal stage. Federal courts debated the limits of presidential power to deploy National Guard troops without state consent, while Chicago's lawyers sought injunctions against ICE crackdowns and mass detentions. Johnson's executive orders were framed as defensive maneuvers against legal overreach, while Trump's allies argued the Constitution allowed federal action in emergencies of domestic insurrection. In these proceedings, Johnson's credibility was repeatedly challenged, with opposing counsel highlighting the scale of Chicago's unsolved murders and rampant shootings. The contrast with Washington, D.C. was frequently invoked. There, a Trump-ordered National Guard deployment had sharply reduced violent crime, a fact even critics begrudgingly acknowledged. Commentators pointed to the absence of shootings during holiday weekends in D.C. as proof of effectiveness, juxtaposing it with Chicago's relentless bloodshed. In one broadcast, the argument was put bluntly.
They're going to be stabbed. Their wife's going to be shot. Their car's gone.
The implication was unmistakable. Johnson was rejecting a model that demonstrably worked elsewhere, for political rather than practical reasons. In public exchanges and legal filings, the rhetorical clash between Trump and Johnson reached national attention. Trump's statements consistently highlighted Chicago as a case study in failed urban leadership. To Trump, the issue was not abstract. It was a measurable crisis of shootings, murders, and failed prosecutions. His argument was that if the federal government could secure D.C. through National Guard deterrence, it could replicate the outcome in Chicago. Johnson, however, cast his role differently, as protector of the city against what he characterized as militarized intrusion. For Johnson, the fight was framed less about crime statistics and more about identity, sovereignty, and history. But critics argued this was a dangerous distraction from the immediate reality of shootings in the city's neighborhoods. Court proceedings underscored the tension. Johnson's executive orders became exhibits in filings challenging Trump's authority, while federal attorneys cited Chicago's crime rates as justification for intervention. Each side invoked constitutional language, Johnson appealing to the 10th Amendment's protection of state and local powers, Trump's allies citing Article 4, Section 4, which obligates the federal government to guarantee every state protection against domestic violence. Judges pressed both sides on precedent. Could Washington impose law enforcement in a city against the will of its mayor? And was Chicago's murder epidemic severe enough to qualify as an insurrection or domestic emergency? Meanwhile, the city's statistics kept mounting. Over the span of a year, Chicago police reported seizing more than 24,000 illegal firearms, an unprecedented number. Yet, for every weapon confiscated, multiple new guns entered through trafficking routes. Arrests lagged far behind incidents, with clearance rates hovering at 16%. For citizens, these numbers translated into lived reality. Neighborhoods where shootings were routine, where children were gunned down near playgrounds, and where holiday weekends brought casualty reports, resembling war bulletins. Johnson's insistence on attributing the crisis to external sources, red states supplying weapons, grew controversial in court and public debate. Critics argued that even if true, this did not absolve local leadership from responsibility. Trump's allies painted Johnson as a mayor more concerned with ideological battles than saving lives. They cited statistics of murder rates exceeding global hotspots to argue Chicago had effectively surrendered to gangs and cartels. Johnson's attorneys countered by accusing the Trump administration of staging a political power grab, exploiting Chicago's struggles for electoral advantage. Both narratives relied on selective framing, but the facts remained stark. Hundreds dead annually, tens of thousands of illegal guns circulating, and a city unable to assure basic safety. Federal authorities, meanwhile, kept building their case. In background briefings and courtroom references, the FBI and DEA linked Chicago's violence not just to local gangs, but to international trafficking networks. Prosecutors cited ongoing cartel cases as evidence that the city's violence was not merely local, but tied to broader organized crime. These revelations sharpened the stakes of the court proceedings proceedings. Johnson's defiance, critics argued, risked shielding not just gangs, but transnational cartels embedded in the city. Thus, the narrative stood sharply divided. On one side, Trump and federal authorities argued Chicago had reached a tipping point where extraordinary intervention was justified. On the other, Johnson insisted that any federal presence was an unacceptable violation of rights, framing his courtroom defense as a fight for democracy itself. Between these positions lay the citizens of Chicago, navigating daily life in a city where murders outpaced metropolises worldwide and where, in legal chambers, the question of who truly governed Chicago remained unresolved. Cartel secrets exposed. Court documents, federal indictments, and sworn testimonies have consistently revealed Chicago's role as a major hub for cartel operations in the United States. While local debates often focus on shootings, robberies, or gun possession, federal investigations have long pointed to a deeper structural issue. Chicago is a distribution capital for international narcotics trafficked by the world's most violent cartels. This reality has surfaced repeatedly in courtrooms, where cartel leaders, associates, and traffickers have been tried, convicted, and sentenced, providing a rare window into the machinery behind the city's violence. The roots of Chicago's cartel connection stretch back decades, but much of the recent focus has centered on the Sinaloa cartel. Once under the leadership of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, Sinaloa built Chicago into what prosecutors described as a logistical hub for U.S. drug distribution. The cartel's operations were exposed in court through the testimony of twin brothers Pedro and Margarito Flores, Chicago natives who became key cooperators for the federal government. Their accounts, corroborated by surveillance and seizures, detailed how tons of cocaine, heroin, and methamphetamine were funneled into the city and then distributed across the Midwest. The Flores twins' testimony, delivered in federal court, revealed how cartel leaders viewed Chicago as indispensable, not merely for its market, but for its central geography, offering trucking, rail, and air links that made nationwide distribution efficient. Court proceedings confirmed that cartel networks used Chicago gangs as local enforcers and distributors. Wholesale shipments arrived by semi-truck, train containers, and private aircraft, often concealed among legitimate goods. Once in the city, the drugs were parceled out to gangs that controlled specific territories, turning neighborhood disputes into cartel-fueled wars. Prosecutors argued that this structure explained why Chicago consistently led the nation in murders. Local violence was the visible symptom of international cartels competing for dominance through proxies. Even after El Chapo's capture and extradition, his network's imprint on Chicago remained. One commentator with first-hand experience explained the dynamic.
For a very long time, Chicago was almost like headquarters for the Sinaloa cartel. El Chapo and his people, and the twins. It was like I've told you guys in the past, Chicago is a hub. There's many ways of, once it gets there, to distribute to other cities, and it's just because of the railroad system, the trucks, the airplanes. I mean, you name it. It's right in the middle. So it's a perfect place to call home.
Court evidence repeatedly confirmed these logistics, documenting seizures at freight yards, warehouses, and suburban homes converted into stash houses. As the Sinaloa cartel's grip weakened, federal intelligence began highlighting the rise of a new contender, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. Unlike Sinaloa, CJang specialized in heroin and fentanyl, two drugs that became the driving force of America's overdose crisis. By the mid-2010, Chicago had become the leading city in the nation for heroin overdoses, a grim status linked directly to CJang's expansion. Federal prosecutions of CJang operatives documented their methods: higher purity heroin at lower prices, combined with aggressive violence to secure distribution lines. This strategy undercut rivals and ensured CJang's dominance in Chicago's evolving drug landscape. Testimony from former traffickers described how, after El Chapo's downfall and the imprisonment of more than 70 cartel associates, CJang seized the opportunity to expand into Chicago. Court cases confirmed these claims. Indictments in Chicago federal court directly tied CJang to massive heroin and fentanyl shipments, some concealed in produce trucks, others flown through private routes into the Midwest. The result was a new wave of overdoses, deaths, and gang wars linked not only to cocaine and meth, but now to opioids at unprecedented scale. One striking courtroom theme was how cartels adapted to law enforcement pressure. Prosecutors presented evidence showing that while Mexico-based cartels used extreme violence south of the border, beheadings, public executions, mass graves, in Chicago, their strategy was more discreet. Local associates testified that cartels prioritized business efficiency over spectacle, leaving most of the street violence to gangs, as one former trafficker explained.
The cartels, they might be killing and cutting heads in Mexico and all that, but in the US, and especially in Chicago, it is business as like always. Chicago, right? Like street gang capital of America. Chicago, #1 in murders, gang murders.
Court evidence supported this claim. While the cartels themselves rarely carried out killings in Chicago, their money and drugs fueled gang disputes that escalated homicide rates. The impact of cartel infiltration on Chicago was not limited to drug supply. Federal financial cases exposed how cartel money was laundered through local businesses, real estate, and even banks. In court, agents detailed schemes involving shell companies and cash smuggling, some facilitated by corrupt insiders. The sums were staggering, hundreds of millions annually, funneled back to Mexico while leaving Chicago communities destabilized by addiction and violence. Meanwhile, new prosecutions revealed how cartel dominance was reshaping the local drug market, with multiple organizations competing: Sinaloa Remnants, CJNG, Los Rojos, Guerreros Unidos. Competition led to fluctuating purity, falling prices, and increased accessibility. Court filings noted that heroin could be purchased in Chicago for as little as $10 per bag, cheaper than in many smaller cities, a function of supply saturation. As one former insider summarized,
The one thing that cartels always want is to have control. And what I mean by that is they'll control the city, so they're able to control the price on the product and the quality, pretty much monopolizing it to the point where this is what you're going to get for what you're going to get, you're paying for.
The courtroom record consistently showed that this control was maintained through partnerships with Chicago gangs, intimidation of rivals, and a ruthless focus on profit. Federal judges, in sentencing hearings, described the challenge starkly. One called Chicago the most significant cartel hub outside the southwest border, noting that its central location and infrastructure made it uniquely vulnerable. Another emphasized that despite decades of prosecutions, the city remained a magnet for traffickers. These judicial comments underscored the futility of localized approaches. Chicago's problem was not merely one of policing, but of international criminal networks operating through its streets. The exposure of cartel operations in court proceedings had political ramifications as well. Trump and his allies used these cases to argue that Johnson's administration was outmatched, incapable of addressing problems that were international in scope. They pointed to DEA and FBI testimony as proof that the crisis went beyond gang violence. It was a matter of national security. Johnson, however, rarely addressed cartel influence directly. Instead, he continued to frame the crisis as one of gun trafficking and systemic inequality. Critics seized on this omission, suggesting that by ignoring the cartel dimension, Johnson left Chicago defenseless against forces far larger than local police could contain. Another case that drew national attention involved a major trafficker extradited to Chicago, identified in court as a co-founder of the Sinaloa cartel alongside El Chapo. In dramatic sentencing remarks, prosecutors declared,
flooded the country with drugs, and the reign of terror is over. Bondi says Elmira will spend the rest of his life behind bars and die in a U.S. federal prison where he belongs. He's one of the most powerful drug traffickers in the world.
Such statements highlighted both the scale of cartel power and the rarity of securing such convictions. For Chicagoans, it reinforced the reality that their city was not merely suffering from local crime, but was entangled in the global drug war. Thus, the exposure becomes clear. Through courtroom testimony, federal prosecutions, and indictments, Chicago's cartel ties were laid bare. The city was revealed as a linchpin in the drug trade, its violence fueled by international organizations using gangs as proxies. The evidence showed that while Johnson sparred with Trump over federal troops, the deeper threat to Chicago's safety was structural, embedded, and international, one that no local executive order could easily deflect. The fallout. The exposure of Chicago's cartel entanglements through court proceedings did not stay confined to legal briefs or DEA press releases. It spilled into the political arena, where every revelation became ammunition in the battle over who truly controlled Chicago, its elected mayor, or the networks of traffickers, gangs, and cartels documented in federal trials. For Trump and his allies, the narrative was straightforward. Brandon Johnson was failing, Chicago was out of control, and the courts had proven the scale of cartel infiltration. For Johnson and his supporters, the federal government was exaggerating cartel influence as a pretext to strip the city of autonomy and impose militarized solutions. This clash unfolded not only in campaign speeches, but also in public hearings and media coverage. Federal officials frequently pointed to Chicago's status as a primary heroin and fentanyl hub, citing indictments as proof. One commentator explained the underlying motivation for Trump's focus.
A large part of the war in Chicago that Trump wants to zero in on is the fact that Chicago is the location of where the cartel is having Mexican shootouts and gang turf battles over the control of the fentanyl and drug trade.
This argument reframed the debate. The issue was not just crime statistics, but Chicago's role as a battlefield in an international conflict. Johnson, however, continued to resist the framing. In public remarks, he reiterated that Chicago's crisis was driven by external gun trafficking, systemic inequality, and lack of investment. His speeches emphasized protecting Chicagoans from federal overreach, yet his critics charged that this rhetoric avoided the central reality exposed in court, that Chicago was functioning as an operational hub for some of the most violent organizations in the world. In one heated broadcast, the accusation was blunt.
They'd rather all their citizens suffer, and in cases like Chicago, die, get murdered, instead of letting Trump do something that their citizens will enjoy and get credit for it. Nope. I don't care how many people have to die. I will never let Donald Trump make my city safer.
Whether hyperbolic or not, such critiques reflected a growing public perception that politics was taking precedence over lives. Federal prosecutors emphasized that cartel cases in Chicago were not just about drugs, but about the security of the nation. Judges, in sentencing remarks, underscored that Chicago's geography and infrastructure made it indispensable for traffickers. In one case, prosecutors revealed that cartels viewed Chicago as equivalent to a capital city in their U.S. operations. These declarations carried weight because they came under oath, backed by evidence seized in raids, wiretaps, and surveillance. The exposure in court was not speculation, it was sworn fact. Trump leveraged these findings to argue for extraordinary measures. The implication was that even Democratic officials in other cities acknowledged the effectiveness of federal intervention, while Johnson stood alone in rejection. Trump's team framed Johnson's defiance not as courage, but as obstinacy at the expense of public safety. The fallout was not limited to federal versus local conflict. Within Illinois, Governor J.B. Pritzker faced his own scrutiny. Asked whether Chicago was safe, he deflected by criticizing Trump rather than addressing the direct question. Commentators seized on this evasiveness, contrasting it with trauma-centered doctors who, through experience, had become adept at saving gunshot victims, a grim testament to the frequency of shootings. The narrative that emerged was that Illinois leaders, like Johnson, were more focused on political positioning than acknowledging the severity of cartel-fueled violence in their city. The aftermath of courtroom exposure reverberated across Chicago's politics. Every new indictment and sentencing involving cartel operatives added pressure on city leadership to respond more concretely. The tension escalated whenever Johnson faced reporters. At one press conference, when pressed on Trump's criticisms, he dismissed the issue rather than confronting the underlying facts.
Since you are begging, I do believe that Donald Trump is intimidated. I think.
Okay. He quickly pivoted to claims of racial intimidation, leaving questions about cartel prosecutions unanswered. This avoidance strategy protected him politically among allies, but exposed him to relentless attacks from opponents who pointed to DEA indictments as proof that the city was under siege from cartels. Federal authorities, meanwhile, expanded their public case. Prosecutors in Chicago outlined in court how tons of fentanyl and heroin were flowing through the city each year, distributed nationally by gangs but controlled at the top by Mexican organizations. They emphasized that this was not speculation but the result of seizures, wiretaps, and financial records presented in trials. The weight of this evidence made it increasingly difficult for city officials to argue the violence was solely about poverty or gun trafficking. The cartels were embedded, operational, and profiting at scales far beyond ordinary gangs. Trump's messaging capitalized on these revelations. In televised remarks, he consistently contrasted Johnson's rhetoric with the hard data presented in federal court. He argued that Johnson's refusal to cooperate with federal forces amounted to negligence.
These doctors in these Chicago trauma centers, they see these bullet wounds, and they know exactly how to take care of them. So they are saving so many lives of people just because the death toll is 8. If you get 57 people shot, you should credit the doctors and hospitals in Chicago for that, you know? Amazing. So he won't answer the question, which of course is no. If you were going to be really honest, he would go, no. I would never want my loved ones traveling on those savage trains at night. or even in the daytime.
The implication was unmistakable. Chicago's survival was owed less to leadership than to medical professionals patching up endless streams of gunshot victims. As these arguments circulated, the courts continued producing material that reinforced the federal narrative. In one landmark sentencing, prosecutors declared that a cartel figure tied to El Chapo had flooded the country with drugs, a statement entered into the official record. Such declarations were devastating politically because they reframed Chicago not simply as a struggling city, but as a central artery in the global drug trade. Johnson's framing, that violence was driven by red states' guns, could not easily withstand the weight of sworn testimony showing Chicago's centrality to international trafficking. This growing disconnect highlighted the broader stakes. If Chicago, with its resources, infrastructure, and status as the nation's third-largest city, could be so deeply penetrated by cartels, what did that mean for the rest of the country? Every ton of heroin or fentanyl moved through its channels meant thousands of overdoses across the Midwest and East Coast. From a federal perspective, allowing Chicago to operate as a cartel hub unchecked posed a direct threat to national security. From Johnson's perspective, however, conceding this framing risked justifying federal militarization, something he was determined to prevent. The clash raised constitutional questions. Could the federal government deploy troops into Chicago without state or local consent, citing cartel activity as justification? Legal scholars debated whether Article 4's protection against invasion could be interpreted to include cartel infiltration. In federal court, Trump's allies argued that cartels represented not just crime but a form of foreign aggression. Johnson's attorneys countered that conflating criminal networks with invasion was a distortion that would erode constitutional limits. These legal arguments, played out before judges, underscored how deeply the cartel issue had become entwined with questions of sovereignty and governance. Public perception, however, was less concerned with constitutional nuance and more with lived reality. Citizens saw neighborhoods dominated by gangs, shootings disrupting daily life, and families devastated by overdoses. For many, whether the threat was labeled gang violence or cartel infiltration mattered less than the urgent need for safety. Yet the courtroom exposure of cartel dominance added a new layer. The violence was not merely local, but tied to international organizations with virtually limitless resources. This realization fueled a sense of helplessness. How could local leaders solve a problem rooted in global criminal economies? The political consequences for Johnson deepened as crime statistics remained stubbornly high. His opponents painted him as a mayor who, in court and in public, chose rhetoric over results. They accused him of ignoring the cartel evidence because acknowledging it would weaken his opposition to federal intervention. His supporters countered that Trump was exploiting the crisis for political gain, inflating cartel influence to justify authoritarian measures. Between these positions, the public was left with a fractured narrative, one side emphasizing sworn court testimony about cartel dominance, the other stressing systemic inequality and resisting military solutions. By the time the latest wave of indictments concluded, the courtroom had produced a clear record. Chicago was a hub for cartel activity, its gangs acting as intermediaries, its streets awash in narcotics and violence. Judges, prosecutors, and even former traffickers testified to this reality. Whether Johnson chose to acknowledge it or not, the facts were preserved in official transcripts, sentencing memoranda, and federal records. Trump's narrative, though politically charged, rested on this documented foundation. The exposure in court thus had lasting implications. It demonstrated that cartel infiltration was not confined to border towns or remote trafficking routes, but had embedded itself in the heart of America's urban landscape. It revealed that local leadership, when unwilling or unable to confront this reality, left cities vulnerable. And it highlighted a broader fracture in American governance between federal responsibility for national security and local insistence on autonomy. Thanks for watching. If you found this video informative and interesting, be sure to check out other similar and amazing videos on the screen. See you in the next video.